Hey y'all, here at OS Reviews. Today we're taking a revisited look at the Samsung Galaxy S10 Lite as we head into 2023. So time really does fly. This is a phone that's now approaching 3 years old, and it's part of the S10 series, but what's a little bit confusing is it actually came out after the regular S10 and even the S10e, which is more well known as the smaller, more compact edition of Samsung's 10th generation flagship smartphones. Rather, the S10 Lite is actually a really big phone. It has this ginormous 6.7-inch AMOLED HDR10 compatible display, which is gorgeous to look at, sharing a similar footprint to something like a Samsung Galaxy Note as opposed to the regular S10. And perhaps a reason why this is still a part of that S10 line as compared to part of Samsung's Galaxy A series, which is more well known for their budget mid-tier offerings, would be the processor. Underneath the hood, we still have the same Snapdragon 855, which is found on the S10 lineup. A very capable octa-core processor, which may not beat the newest Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 anymore, but still delivers really smooth and ultra-consistent performance that's more than enough for the daily user, and we'll talk more about the performance of this phone later on. Otherwise, this device is also notable in that it has the biggest battery out of the S10 lineup with a massive 4,500 milliamp hour capacity cell that supports 45 watts for quick charging. Makes this kind of an endurance champion where I was able to use it comfortably for over 2 days before I needed to recharge it again. If I was lighter on usage, sometimes even stretches 3 days. Now, perhaps the biggest reason why you may want to consider something like an S10 phone in general is because of the pricing. You can now find them easily for around $100 or so when you're shopping around. Now puts these squarely into the budget territory and a much better value for folks to consider. Taking a closer look at other elements of the design here, the S10 Lite has a aluminum alloy rail and just makes the phone still feel quite premium as you're holding it. With that being said, on the very back here, this is one area where it's a little bit more of a cost-saving measure compared to the regular S10, is it's constructed out of a polycarbonate plastic. Samsung calls it glastic, but it doesn't feel too hollow or cheap, and of course has the benefit of not being as brittle as glass. And I do really like this particular white edition that has these super dazzling color effects as you shine it across the light. I think it just looks very beautiful in terms of that finish. Now, in terms of camera array, you have access to a primary 48 megapixel sensor with optical image stabilization. There's a dual tone LED flash and then a 12 megapixel ultra wide angle lens along with a 5 megapixel macro depth sensor lens. The very bottom here features a single speaker, so that's also one area where unfortunately you don't get a stereo set, so audio quality takes a little bit of a hit on this model, but it's still passable. We have access to very well positioned and clicky volume and power keys. The other spine features access just to the SIM card slot, and then that is pretty much it. No headphone jack, of course, on this phone. The front here again just houses that gorgeous 6.7-inch Super AMOLED display with subtle 2.5D curved glass, but the screen itself is completely flat, which is also one other difference compared to, again, something like the aforementioned regular S10, which has more of a dramatic curve to it. The benefit of a flat screen is that you don't get as much accidental touches, and it's a little easier just to control, which I do personally prefer because of the larger canvas that we have here. We do have an under-display fingerprint scanner, which is actually very fast on this phone, as you can see there. Accuracy is one of the better ones that you'll find on a under-display unit. The top also houses a hole punch cutout for that 32 megapixel front-facing selfie camera, also a pretty high count in terms of resolution. Now, in terms of other internals, again, for a 2020 flagship, you do get all the essentials, whether it's Wi-Fi, GPS, Bluetooth, NFC, FM radio, all those connectivity options you have fully covered on here. Although a few notable remarks is, one, this phone does not have Qi wireless charging. So one other slight compromise just to make the cost a little bit lower, as well as there is no waterproofing to speak of. Though there are still rubber gaskets found around, say, the SIM cards tray when you remove it. There is a little bit of rain from daily usage, it should still survive. Base model comes with 6 gigabytes of RAM coupled with 128 gigs of built-in storage, which are all decent specs, along with that Snapdragon 855 and of course Samsung's One UI. We're still talking about a pretty up-to-date user interface. Everything still flies in terms of fluidity, but just note there is no fast refresh rate on this model, as back in 2020 the trend was really just starting to pick up. So the successor of this phone, which would be the Samsung Galaxy S10 Fan Edition, does have a faster refresh rate screen that will give you even more fluidity when you're scrolling down longer menus. The S20 Fan Edition typically sells for around $100 more at this point in time. So arguably, if you're on a tighter budget, this might be a better value, at least on paper, since you don't lose too much in terms of performance. In fact, on a design perspective, the S10 Lite may seem even a little bit fresher because it has smaller bezels. And in terms of the UI experience, currently it is running on One UI 4.1. However, it's bound to receive the Android 13 update as well when that becomes available. It's good to see that Samsung have started to become better at supporting their phones via software updates. It's something that the industry has kind of called out Android players. Gradually, we're seeing a better response as manufacturers are now getting you a couple of years of support. And whether you're a fan or not, you have to admit that it's one of the most complete launchers that you can currently find on Android. Pretty much every single feature that you would possibly imagine you can often find on Samsung's One UI. Although there will still be a few cases where apps might be slightly duplicated because you get the regular Google suite and then you have Samsung's version of those apps, which is still not quite as clean in a way, but at least they give you the option to choose. That also extends with Samsung's partnership with Microsoft, and there are a handful of Microsoft apps pre-installed on their S10 phones, including Office Suite, OneDrive, Outlook. The handful of other social media apps, including Facebook, Netflix, are all pre-built onto the phone when you take it out of the box. But again, if you don't want to use them, you can always uninstall them per your liking. Let's take a quick look at the camera experience next. Despite the light moniker, this is as good as the regular Samsung Galaxy S10s when it comes to the photography capabilities. It even recognizes if you're trying to scan in text, and if you tap to scan, it will crop it and only save the text portion and try and make it so it's flattened out, as you can see there. Not to mention that you can actually scan QR codes directly in the camera app and it will recognize that as well. So there's a lot of hidden smart features in Samsung's current camera implementation, which I do appreciate after using it with a little bit more detail. Other things here are all quite easy to use. We have some zoom controls, auto HDR, as well as stabilization, AI scene detection. Those modes can all be automatically recognized, filters, effects, which are all, again, making it a pretty cohesive experience that's easy to use. Under More, you can find additional controls, including a Pro mode, portrait video mode as well with that secondary lens, which is quite neat. So it can blur the background continuously even as you're moving around. And what can I say? Overall, it's still an excellent camera experience, which is super consistent. Colors are definitely on the more saturated side, which is a part of the typical grading and color science that Samsung opts for, but it still is a very beautiful looking effect with plenty of sharpness, especially with that primary 48 megapixel lens, and that auto HDR is doing wonders in terms of creating still lots of details in the shadowy elements of the shot. Arguably, you can find even better photo quality if you are looking at a Pixel or an iPhone, at least one of the latest generation models. But I have to say, for something, again, in this $100 price range that you can now find it at, there's nothing to scoff at when it comes to the photo capabilities of the S10 series. And the video quality is, generally speaking, quite good. Of course, the stabilization here is definitely helping in terms of the smoothness. Sometimes there are still moments where the focus might be kind of hunting around a little bit more than, say, an iPhone, but in general, it is doing quite well. Point being that even in challenging conditions, as you can tell, it is doing really well. One area, though, where maybe the Pixel can still beat this particular camera would be in extreme low light conditions. Even though this has a night mode, it's still not 100% as good as the Pixel when it comes to almost magically drawing in an impossible amount of light and detail in pitch darkness. So again, if you're considering this phone, just know that the camera performance is certainly nothing that you'll be disappointed with. And loading back something like a quick YouTube video here, you can tell that overall it's super fast when it comes to watching back clips. Again, the support for HDR10 means that you can also use this comfortably for Netflix in full HD resolution, and everything is still going to be working flawlessly, really without any problems, and just makes it feel like you're holding onto content as opposed to a phone necessarily. This looks, I would argue, as modern as any other Samsung phone out there today, and the 6 gigs of RAM base model is also sufficient in terms of RAM management. I was able to open up around 20 tabs in the browser, jump back and forth between different open apps, and things are still largely retained without having to reload too often. So it's still a very comfortable and smooth experience, primarily again thanks to that 855 processor. So here we have a pretty complex web page, lots of ads and video elements, but the phone here is still doing very well in terms of loading things back. It doesn't feel too slow or choppy at all, and antenna reception quality also remains excellent in terms of Wi-Fi and cellular alike. So these regular day-to-day tasks, you don't feel really pushing the processor at all. The phone remains still quite cool in terms of temperatures as you are handling it. The Samsung Galaxy S10 Lite does not support DeX, so that is one feature that is unfortunately missing here. I really wish Samsung would have carried over from the regular S10 and S10e. That is, if you're connecting this using the Type-C port to a TV, it doesn't transform into a desktop mode, unfortunately, but that is really the only missing software feature. Some of the Samsung apps, including their clock widget, is also a little bit different from stock Android, but also looks rather clean, as well as apps like their weather widget, which slowly changes colors as you're swiping further down below. Everything here just works and flows quite well on this phone, and has very good microphones with noise cancellation capabilities, so even if you're in slightly crowded spaces, I had no issues in terms of being heard, even though if you look very closely, the earpiece is just this tiny little sliver there at the top, just to preserve that very good screen-to-body ratio. Nothing from the Play Store that you can install that this phone can't play, because again the 855, even though not the newest anymore, is still a very capable chipset in its own right that includes titles like PUBG or Asphalt series, which are more graphically demanding. You can still play on here and get a pretty smooth experience. Just keep in mind that again, there is no ultra fast refresh rate display, but aside from that, things are still chugging along at a very good frame rate. Things are smooth in terms of their loading action, and overall the phone also remains quite cool during thermals, even as you're pressing it a little bit harder. That massive 4,500 milliamp hour capacity battery also becomes very beneficial when you are gaming for longer sessions. Some other titles which might be a little bit more 3D intensive in terms of their graphics, but again, still loading up at a very fast and responsive rate that you feel like it's still a very comfortable experience as you are playing along, really with no complaints here as you are interacting with this phone in general. Of course, the flip side that you will have to keep in mind is with a larger phone, you do have something bigger to carry around, and 6.7 inches is by no means a small phone. It actually is one of the bigger footprints in general that you'll find, and kind of goes into the phablet territory. So if you want something more petite, you have smaller hands, this is definitely not going to be perhaps the best choice. That added screen real estate though does come in handy even if you're doing things like ebook reading, as well as other tasks like say some document editing. It just becomes more versatile and easy to use. So that's more or less it as far as our revisited look at the Samsung Galaxy S10 Lite, and overall I think it's held up remarkably well, at least from a design perspective. It still looks super current and fresh. This beautiful display looks as good as ever. It feels really nice in the hand. It gets all the essentials right, from a very good camera system to long battery life that will last you for 2 or 3 days before you have to recharge it again, a fast under-display fingerprint scanner, and overall still a very fluid user interface when it comes to day-to-day usage and even some light gaming. This is still a phone that can really handle everything you want to throw at it on a day-to-day basis. So you can check out more details if interested in the links down below, but for now that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been the Galaxy S10 Lite Revisited.